This podcast offers general information about sleep and wellness, not medical advice. Sleep difficulties can have serious underlying medical and mental health causes. Please consult with a qualified healthcare provider for personalized advice. This podcast complements but does not replace professional care.
Well, Taylor, thank you so much for joining me and making time to chat.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this.
Wonderful. Can you tell me a little bit about you, your practice, and maybe you tell me a little bit more about what it means to be a Menopause Society certified practitioner and like what brought you into working specifically around women's health?
So I'm Dr. Taylor Thurston. I'm a naturopathic doctor. I practice in a private healthcare space in Victoria, but I see patients all across British Columbia. I have a clinical focus in mental health, and I think that journey happened naturally through my own experience with mental health, and I think has kind of evolved since starting practice and really have a passion and focus in the connection between women's hormones and mental health.
I think there's probably a huge gap, right, in knowledge specific to around and research perhaps around women's health and well-being, and maybe being able to target interventions, towards that. So how do hormones affect women's life, and particularly sleep, at different stages of their life?
Yeah, I think it's a big question. I think there's so many things that can happen. But I think where we see these huge spaces of time that can have really major impacts on hormones and sleep and women's overall health would be perimenopause, and menopause is a big one. And how those fluctuating hormones can impact people's quality of sleep, but also intermittent waking, hard time falling asleep. But the other area that's pretty obvious, and I think most moms would resonate with, but the fact of just the perinatal and postpartum period is a huge area where both mom and dad definitely struggle with sleep just because of how many major changes are happening, both hormonally, but also just actual life changes that are going on.
Yeah.
And then one area I feel doesn't really get talked about enough is just how sleep can be affected in that luteal phase. So your PMS or more severe form of PMDD being a big part of that. I don't think is talked about enough is just how much those hormonal changes can impact sleep. And I think particularly when we're talking about PMS or PMDD is that it's not necessarily and we maybe will talk about this more, but in terms of hormone balance and things like that, but it's actually more so the changes of hormones and the fluctuations of hormones that we're seeing have that impact on people's mental health and sleep particularly, rather than it be the actual balance of the two. That's also just an important thing I think to talk about, especially with PMS and PMDD. There could be pain involved in that, but we actually do see that hormonal changes do impact people's sleep, and then it just makes them feel more tired, and then it's this vicious cycle with how those things impact one another.
Absolutely. Many women that I've worked with too report things like just discomfort at night, like temperature fluctuations, or they just feel wired in the middle of the night. And what are kind of common things that you ask about or look for when you're talking to women who are reporting these challenges?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is just tracking it, because when people come in, unless they're specifically coming in with the sleep, I would ask them does it get worse around your period? Have you noticed changed in the last 5 years? If they're in their 40s or in the menopause transition, I think it's pretty obvious when we're in that postpartum period, we're yeah, we're not sleeping as much as we would like or imagined. But particularly with PMS and perimenopause is have you tracked those changes? Have you noticed before your period that those are the times where you're having a harder time sleep, or you're waking up with more anxiety, or your mind is racing so much you can't fall asleep. And sometimes people are oh, I never maybe noticed that. And then we kind of track that over the next few months, and then you're yeah, I think that's actually where things are getting a lot worse for you, that we need to kind of like preventively focus on that time versus like, sometimes not every night is bad, but that week 1 or 2 week before your period, there's some changes.
There's such power in just knowledge and knowing that to anticipate that sleep might be bumpy around this time for me and be able to be it's easy to like tap into like self-compassion, right? It's like it's not just me. I've done something wrong, like I'm just a bad sleeper. I hear that so often. I'm just a bad sleeper. I mean, when it comes to like those things, and women are so frustrated. These women are on social media, and they hear the term hormone balance, or maybe there's something wrong with my hormones. What does it mean?
Yeah. It's tough. So the word hormone balance or hormone imbalance per se is like not a medical term. Like I think sometimes we actually do disservice to women by saying you have like a hormonal imbalance because if there's this like broad term that we don't necessarily have like a medical diagnosis for it, then like how do we actually support you through that? So that's
Mhm.
one thing. But then on the other side is that I think for so long women have been maybe dismissed, invalidated in their healthcare experience. And so, like, it can't be your hormones, those types of things. And I don't necessarily think that I think that hormones play a huge role in women's health, particularly because of how many fluctuating things are going on from month to month or during that
Yes.
transition. But I don't think it's a matter of necessarily balancing these like perfect amount of estrogen and progesterone. I
Yes.
think that I think it's more so like these conversations are hard because it's not to dismiss the fact that hormones are not playing a massive role in how they're feeling. It's just that like the perfect amount of estrogen and progesterone or ratios of hormones is not necessarily the goal.
Yes.
Support women through these fluctuations that matter more. And how we do that is actually different than trying to get these like exact numbers. I always kind of bring this up as an example, but if we took many, many different women across either PMS or these different transitions, like someone who maybe has like a different imbalance of hormones may actually be feeling better compared to somebody like we can't tell from like hormones how people experience those changes. And so that's always a kind of a good example, but that's not to also say that like having low thyroid is like a true hormonal concern, but we wouldn't call it a hormonal imbalance. Like we would be calling it whatever that diagnosis actually is, which is like hypothyroidism. Or if the diagnosis is perimenopause, it's not through a hormonal imbalance. So I think having the terminology and like getting that terminology right really helps people like get the proper treatment and support that they actually deserve and need. Yeah.
It's rarely so black and white. And I appreciate how you really kind of highlight the importance of like personalizing care to that person. That example is great. Like you take 5 women who are all in menopause, can have drastically different experiences with sleep and comfort at night because it's not just about, like you say, like about hormones, right? That's such a great point. When we're just really in the thick of like sleep troubles, you just want something that will help, and
Yeah.
just makes it like ripe for like this product that will balance your hormones. But
Mm.
now we know that's not a thing in of itself.
Particularly with that perimenopause and menopause transition, I think that hormonal balance comes to place because really like there's not enough progesterone that there was before because you're not having these like ovulatory cycles. So that
Yeah.
or like you're having these estrogen dominant cycles because things are cycling, but the term itself isn't actually that helpful. And so understanding that can be really important, I think, for patients.
So when you're working with women, you're experiencing various challenges, particularly around sleep. Do you have a book or something that you provide them and ask them to kind of track for a week or two, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I think borrowing from things from cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia,
Mhm.
um, I think the sleep diary can be really important. And I think teasing out, especially for that transition of like what else is also impacting your sleep, because so many things change in that transition. And so like maybe it's night sweats that are impacting your quality of sleep. Maybe there can be iron deficient. There's so many different things that can impact your sleep and sleep quality. So I think having that long initial to kind of go through what's actually going on for women. But yeah, I think if sleep's the primary concern, it would be like going through the full in-depth intake and potentially having them track for a couple weeks to actually like the time are you going to bed? How often are you waking up?
Yeah.
How long are those wakings? When you're waking up, do you feel refreshed? Like all of those things, like nap, caffeine, alcohol, all the parts that really impact people's sleep and sleep quality.
Absolutely. And, if all these disruptions are happening to your sleep, you're uncomfortable, you're hot, you're cold. And then if you're lying there for a really long time in like a cold sweat and misery, that only amplifies, the suffering at night too, right? So
Mhm.
absolutely to understand that and disrupt that process. I mean, that's a great segue to kind of move into the connection between sleep and mental health, an area that you specialize in too. How do you bridge the two, and how do you kind of bring that lens to the people that you work with?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so connected. I think it's one of those situations like, is it the chicken or the egg kind of thing? And that it's like always so connected. And I think that we see that in the research of it being very bi-directional. Like if your sleep quality is poor, it affects your mental health, and your mental health can affect your sleep and your sleep quality and your ability to fall asleep. So I think that for a lot of people that I work with, that is a conversation on both ends. Like, even if like, conversation is mostly around anxiety, low mood, depression,
Mhm.
we're having big conversations around sleep and vice versa. I think that can be a frustrating thing because we're working on so many things, but sleep becomes such an important piece of that. It can feel overwhelming sometimes to work on all the things that are required to feel better too. So just trying to take it like a step at a time too.
And when it comes to like mental health, pretty much
Yeah.
any mental illness that we think about, any mental health struggle, sleep or poor sleep, too much sleep, too little sleep, disrupted
Yeah.
sleep always plays a part in it, and
Big time.
and yeah, I find if we can focus on the sleep itself, and focus on things that we can't control, sometimes we start to feel a bit better.
Probably similar to you too. Like we talk about like when you have a poor sleep, your ability to handle stuff plummets really. Like you can't manage your emotions or the things that are stressful in your life as well when you don't sleep well. And then that makes your sleep worse. So it's always all tied in together.
Absolutely. And, I mean, some of the struggles I hear from women I work with too is that they have such busy lives. They're providing caregiving. They're working full-time jobs. One client I was thinking of last week, she just wants time to play games just to like unwind, but then found that was eating into her sleep. And then nighttime is also difficult for different reasons. And so
Yeah.
how do we find that balance? And I'm curious for you, like, do you hear a lot complaints from women around just troubles turning off their mind or not having enough time for themselves at night? How do you approach that, or how do you bring that into the conversation?
Yeah, I think I validate that it's really hard and that I wish we had like a way to like sometimes make more time but condense it because it's a real common concern and it's hard. You're managing all these roles, but then you also want time for yourself and then makes total sense why your brain can't shut off. And so I think like holding space and talking about how difficult it can be and then doing what we can. I feel like those are the times where, like, sometimes it's actually more effective to, like, double down on those things that help us sleep and that be the non-negotiable thing of, like, we're gonna just solely work on that part. I don't know, for certain situations, this is tough, but, like, where can you say no? Like, what are your non-negotiables? Who can you delegate to? Like, is there anyone that, like, can take some stuff off your friggin' plate? So, yeah, and so that's, like, a big part 'cause I feel like for so many women, it's just, like, adding on one other thing on another, and it's like, where can we get the support we need to, like, get some space for you and, um say no and have boundaries, which are not easy. They're so not easy.
Yeah, and I think that can be so incredibly powerful for someone to come, for example, to chat with you, feel like there's something wrong with their sleep, and say like, "Hey, like maybe it's because you're carrying a lot and have a lot of expectation," and I definitely find with in particular women yet I've worked with, like they feel like there's something they've done something wrong, or there's something
Mhm.
wrong with them that they can't sleep, right? Where it's like, hey, well, from what you're sharing, it's like all these other things.
And it's nice for someone to, like, lay it out for them to
Sure.
get all these things that you're trying to balance. Like, what would you if anybody had come to you with all these struggles as a friend, like, what do you think, right? And that's the other thing, like, I think you
Totally.
talked about that already of, like, some self-compassion around it of, like, well, what would you tell a friend or a loved one or your sister, anyone in your family if that was, like, handling all that? Like, I'm not surprised that that's going on too, right? And kinda taking the weight away from themselves into, like, focusing on, like, the environment, that they're in is helpful too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. I mean, I ask that question all the time, and often whoever I'm asking you to say, like, yeah, I would tell them to relax. You know, it's way easier to offer that advice than to allow ourselves that grace, when we're really suffering. It kind of it reminds me a little bit. I mean, another thing that I often hear, in particular in women who are just have so much on their plate, is the sense of loneliness, and isolation that their experiences can bring, either through menopause, or, they're struggling with their health, or they're not sleeping well and they feel even more alone.
I think that that's where community comes to play, and I think, like,
Mm.
talking about these concerns, I would say, like, across all of the, like, different transitions that I've talked about, I would say that most women also struggle with that, and that, like, finding that support and camaraderie in the fact that, like, you are most definitely not alone in that struggle actually can, like, take some weight off your backpack is kinda how to describe it. I think knowing that you're not alone and you're not experiencing this all by yourself can be, like, really huge. And just to mention, like, in terms of a menopause perspective, like, up to 60% of women experience sleep
Yeah.
issues. So, like,
Yes.
it's huge, right? It's pretty unlikely that you're the only one out there experiencing that, and I think, like, understanding kinda like what you said before with, like, education and knowing and understanding that these things can happen in this transition, like, actually does allow us to be most definitely more self-compassion in that area too.
Yeah, 60%. And that's a lot of
A
women.
lot of people, right? Yeah.
Sometimes that idea of like, yeah, I'm actually not alone just helps us, yeah, reduce that pressure on ourselves. One third of Canadian adults will report sleep troubles at least several times a week, and then 10% of that population go on to have chronic insomnia, like consistent difficulties. And sometimes it's like a bit of a light switch. And I sometimes hear women, and in particular, again, women say, "Oh yeah, like actually, my mom also struggled with her sleep too. Her sleep's be crappy too." And so it's like, oh, maybe I'm being a little bit extra hard on myself unnecessarily.
Yeah, for sure. That's when you need to get more support, even if it doesn't feel like it's, like, in your direct circle, but that's exactly why I'm always, building people's, like, support network, so it's, like, referring to social workers and people that are specialized in sleep or registered clinical counselors and psychologists to have, like, more people on your team to get more support, because that's where, like, things can feel less alone too. You just feel more supported.
I love that. It's like this internal willingness to give yourself some grace and compassion, but also the drive to like build a team around you to really personalize the approach, right? Because yeah, no two women are the same either. You really take a kind of a holistic approach to
Mm.
women's sleep and mental well-being. And we talked a little bit about the importance of like the psychological, right? Being able to, allow self-compassion, knowledge, and understanding. But I'm curious on the other side, from a naturopathic physician's perspective, are there other, like, sometimes women look at like things like supplements, but like things that are
Yeah,
helpful with the particular challenges, like, I don't know, like hot flashes or discomfort. How do you approach
yeah.
that?
It depends on what the sleep issue is. I think it depends on where you are in your life. I think it depends on what you have the capacity for. So that's a
Yeah.
big thing, like, because there's a lot of things we can do for sleep, but where is your capacity at? And what's gonna be the most effective for you right now that you can actually implement into your life? So, for example, for perimenopause and menopause, I think it's really important to just explain that, like, hormone replacement therapy or menopause hormone therapy can be a massive game changer for women. Not everybody's a candidate for it, but understanding that that's an option and that actually does help sleep, um, is an important thing to say because that's not necessarily a supplement or diet, but that actually does have so much research for. Not necessarily FDA approved for sleep, but we've seen lots of evidence that it can be helpful.
Yep.
In terms of like a diet and supplements thing, I would say for the most part, if we had to put it on like a hierarchy of what's going to be the most effective, I would say like diet and supplements tend to be like lower on that tier. And again, like doubling down on that lifestyle piece is probably like we had the most amount of evidence and research. And I think most patients would also say that that's going to make the most difference rather than that sucks sometimes too, because I wish I had like a diet or a pill or a supplement that I would be like, just take this and it will all get better. But unfortunately, that's not always the case, most often not the case when it
Yes.
comes to these like multifactorial things like sleep. So there are some nutrition and like diet and supplements that have evidence for them, mostly depending like if there's like anxiety and mental health pieces going on, or if it's like potentially like a menopause situation. But I would say like that's where cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia shines right through all of those types of things.
The goal of being able to step back a little bit, usually before people have connected with me, and I'm curious for you if you found the same, but like
Yeah.
people have tried a variety of things, melatonin,
Yeah.
magnesium, marijuana,
Yeah.
concoction,
Everything.
prescription, everything under the sun, because they're so desperate. And for some people, they've already swallowed that hard pill that these don't work or isn't addressing the issue, and for others, they're scared of getting into a cycle of relying on things that may not be helpful. With cognitive behavioral therapy, does seem to have the strongest research behind it. How do you kind of approach that with patients?
Mhm.
They're like so desperate, and then perhaps they haven't heard about it. How do you broach it with
Yeah.
women who are experiencing perhaps hormone-related challenges that are causing sleep problems? Like, how do you justify or explain that to them?
Just to add on to what you're saying, like there's a lot of big promises out there in the wellness space of like certain supplements and diets and these regimes. Lots of false promises there too. And I think when you're looking for answers and struggling with your sleep, it makes a lot of sense why you'd want to try all these things that in
Yeah.
theory like could help you. I think that the way that I approach is trying to meet patients like where they're at, like understanding that they've tried a lot of different things. I think that even just allowing them to understand the complexity of sleep and like what is actually required to support that for a long period of time is really helpful. And I think people are really surprised that they've never heard of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Like they've never even heard the word. Lots of people have heard about CBT, but not specifically for insomnia and these like set programs that are available that can really help people. And I think telling people that that's actually the first line therapy and that should be what's tried at some point if they have the capacity to do it. And I think just like talking about it and asking if they have any questions and making sure they understand like the process and what that would look like. Because not everybody has the capacity to do the full program, but there's bits of CBTI that you can bring in that might actually be enough for some people too.
Yeah, absolutely. I found that too, is that it's just like a framework that you can use. And the rationale being, hey, like, often it's behaviors that we've cultivated over time or ways that we're thinking about sleep that are perhaps making it harder or sustaining the sleep trouble. Sometimes that idea that breaking it down a little bit gives people some hope that things can change, especially if they've, if they've, there've been periods where they've slept well in their life, being
Yeah.
able to, well, what's changed since then? Perhaps hormones,
Yeah.
perhaps nothing else has changed. It's your relationship with sleep has changed.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is like the whole idea of approaching that conversation too is just like I think some people have the idea that it's just fixing sleep hygiene. And I think that's another kind of myth busting thing that you can talk to patients about and just generally say that like for a lot of people, most people who suffer with chronic insomnia, then sleep hygiene's not gonna be enough. And so validating that is actually really important because then it makes it like takes the weight off them of being like, I'm not doing the sleep hygiene enough. I'm not good at that, and that's why I'm not sleeping as well.
It's
Yeah.
something else I failed. I failed
Yeah.
sleep hygiene, you know?
Yeah. Exactly. And that's not the case at all. So yeah.
Yeah, or the opposite. People are understandably trying so hard to fix their sleep that
Mm.
sleep's becoming incredibly stressful. And with the woman I was mentioning earlier, one of the things that we changed, or she decided to change, was to actually spend more time in the evening playing some video games a little bit later, when as a bit
Yeah.
of an experiment. And suddenly the evening was a little bit less tense when she was starting to sleep a little bit later, because she was actually sleepy when she got into bed. And I'm curious for you, drawing from the tools in CBTI, are there particular tools that you found really effective for the women that you serve or work with?
That's a really great example too, because I think that especially in like the TikTok world and wellness world, there's like these 25, 300 step routines for sleep that just is like
Oh my God,
cause
this is my 10-step routine.
and so it just kind of made me giggle of like how many things that there are out there for trying to like perfect this routine. And I think that when we get in these habits and then one thing comes off, then it's like I can't sleep. And because sleep is definitely also like a very cognitive thing, that if we feel like we're not going to sleep well because one of our steps got off, then it's probably not going to go well. In that same vein, like, I think some of the things that I often suggest for patients is, like, dedicated worry time. I think that that's helpful for people to just, like, take set a timer for 5, 10 minutes and just, like, get it all out or talk to a friend or write it out on a paper or speak it out loud. And then anytime, like, those things come up, you can remind yourself, like, like, that time is over, that I've already, like, dealt with it, and that's one things that I like, to do for patients, but then the others are, like, yeah, anything I think the other thing is, like, we've gotten really obsessed with, like, finding this perfect relaxation technique, and I think it's different for everybody. And
Yeah.
so that's what I also like, just try to do something that, like, actually unwinds you, that can be different for everybody. Like, I don't often suggest, like, sitting cross-legged on a perfect cushion and meditating if that's, like, not your thing, but I think we can work towards those, like, aspects. But whether it's, like, maybe, enjoying a book or, like you mentioned with, like, the games or just, like, anything that can kinda, like, take your mind off things to unwind and that you chose to do for yourself can be really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, really about personalizing it and giving ourselves permission to do what we enjoy, right? And um, I guess the core element of that in CBTI is about doing it not because it's going to make you sleep or believe that it's going to make you sleep,
Mm.
but you
Yeah.
just enjoy it until you feel sleepy at some point.
Yeah.
But you had said in your TikTok generation, it's so different. Now compared to 20 years ago, we have things that vie for our attention constantly. That little dopamine hit of like, what's next? What's next? What's next? Yeah, it's incredibly challenging sometimes to peel ourselves away from those things too.
Yeah, and I feel like that's probably gonna start to become more and more of a topic. It already is, but, like, how much we are actually, like, glued and addicted to our phones, like, it's really hard to, like, make the space to put that away or charge it in a different room and things like that.
Yeah, creating some kind of buffer that works for you. Do you have any tips in that regard? Because it's not just about the sleep hygiene. If someone's coming to you, they have a really rigid schedule or
Mhm.
routine, or they're just they're approaching nighttime with dread. Is there anything in particular that you offer, or advice that you provide?
I think is kind of the same conversation. I mean, what you even mentioned was really awesome about like going into something to not help you sleep is also really helpful to just like find something that you enjoy or that um can relax you without actually going into it with the aspect of like this has to help me sleep or else. Talking about how rigid thinking and these like super structured things actually can be harmful towards our sleep and I would argue our mental health too. Uh,
Mm,
but it's hard, like, I think that that's, like, a process that we work on, with like a team-based approach over time because maybe we just take one thing off that. Like I think it depends on the woman. There's definitely some people that could add some things to their routine, and there's definitely some women that should probably take a few things off their routine rigidity, and then we go from there. So yeah, I think finding something that they enjoy or that will actually kind of like distract them in some ways, but intentional distraction of like what you're doing for distraction, not like doom scrolling or anything on
It's
on social media.
a
Yeah.
little bit more in control,
Yeah.
and that's hard when we have all these things competing for our attention and keeping us engaged, capturing our attention. You had
Yeah.
mentioned, a lot of people, definitely haven't heard about CBTI if they've heard about Ambien or Dayvigo, all these new kind of sleep medications. And, part of that is just therapy doesn't have a big budget for marketing.
Yeah.
A lot a lot of people have to pay the CURI too, right?
Yes.
It's not covered as much in their benefits. But I mean, for women particularly who often disproportionately report feeling devalued or not heard when they bring their concerns to healthcare providers. What advice would you give them? If women's having sleep troubles, it's been like that for a long time. Yeah, how can they be advocates for themselves? How can they go in prepared?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point because I think that the way, unfortunately, the conventional care system is set up is not necessarily, they don't have a lot of time with their family doctors. And so they can't, explain or elaborate on how long this is going on and how much it's impacting their life. But often tell people to write it down, put it on a paper, and get kind of really specific of how it's affecting me. Like, I'm only sleeping this amount of hours. It's affecting this part of my quality of life or my daily functioning. That's when tracking can be really helpful. Of like, you can bring bring in the aspects like whether you're having hot flashes or night sweats or when your last period was, like all of those things are like very detailed points. And yeah, scale things like I'm this tired from scale of 1 to 10. So I find often the way that we describe our symptoms can really change the way that they're viewed. And that's again not to invalidate the situation, but because of the time constraint. So when you're going into your doctor's office, like explaining it rather than saying I'm not feeling like myself, which is often a common complaint, I'm like, I'm feeling low energy. I'm not sleeping well. I'm only getting this amount of hours of sleep. I'm waking up this amount of times per night. Like, I think being specific and writing them down can be really helpful. And then asking questions like, what are my options for sleep? Like, what are the possibilities that I can look into to help support my sleep or, hormones if that's the case. But, um, yeah, like asking those specific questions for looking for resources or support there. Yeah.
They're great tips. Come in with some objective measures, like I can't concentrate at work. I'm sleeping,
Yes.
I was waking up this many times. But I think that the really powerful question you suggested there is like, what are my options? Because with the time
Yeah.
limited, unfortunately, I've met people who went in to see like a locum GP or NP, and they left with a prescription for an antidepressant with no explanation around when do I stop it, or what does
Yeah.
this mean, or what can happen, with this medication.
Yeah. Like, where did this come from?
Where did this come from?
Yeah. Yeah. Or are there ways that you find helpful in terms of that, like in terms of helping patients support the conversation with their family doctors as well?
Yeah, I think finding the right person to talk to too is so important, and just knowing. I think public education is so important. I refer a lot of people to go get tested for sleep apnea because like, are you
Yes.
you also have really poor sleep quality. You're feeling sleepy during the day. Like, have you talked to someone?
Yeah.
And more often than not, people don't know that that's something that they could talk to somebody about, right? So I'll refer them back to GP, or suggest that they advocate for themselves to get a referral to sleep medicine, to see a sleep
Yeah.
physician, or go
Yeah.
get tested. But similar to you, like, hey, track your sleep for a week, or use the sleep diary that we're working on and bring that to you. But yeah, it's challenging. I think it's the limited time that people have to talk or they don't have a family doctor, or
Yeah.
a naturopathic physician or someone that they trust to
Yeah.
talk to. It's
Yeah.
multi-layered for sure.
And you also brought up a really important point of like sleep apnea being such a big, like underdiagnosed, I often find too, and that I think we have this idea that it has to be this very specific symptom-based picture, but I think that also comes back to like, yeah, that's obstructive sleep apnea is a sleep disorder. I think that also brings up another point of like, some people feel like it's their sleep and they've gotten X amount of sleep and they're sleeping well, but they're still exhausted in their day and they think it's sleep related. But that also comes to the next point of like, yeah, maybe it's sleep apnea, maybe it's iron deficiency. Like there's other things that can come up when it comes to sleep. So that's sometimes what I advocate for patients. I'll send lots of referrals of like, we should test these things to make sure there's nothing else going on or disrupting your sleep quality as well.
Yeah, it comes back to that, key part is the kind of personalized, holistic approach to understanding that sleep is like more often a symptom. Well, poor sleep is often a symptom of something else. Right? It's like the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Often anxiety or hormones or untreated or underdiagnosed, or rather undertreated sleep apnea.
Mhm.
A lot of people, I think, imagine like the grandpa sitting on like a couch, snoring, but
Yes.
it's
Yes.
like, what signs should women be looking at? I'm aware that, for example, menopause can increase the risk of sleep apnea as well,
Yeah.
changes in the body. But yeah, are there particular things that you look out for, or provide education for women around sleep apnea?
Yeah, I think that's a great point to bring up. Prevalence increases over the menopause transition. I think that I think the obvious signs are that if you're snoring really loudly or you're waking up in the middle of the night gasping for air, or like your partner has noticed that. I think the less obvious signs would be fatigue during the day, waking up with headaches sometimes is a common one, and then um, also high blood pressure. So sometimes we don't understand why someone's blood pressure is high. That can be another aspect with sleep apnea that I think gets often overlooked. And I think the other part is that sometimes this can happen, especially when we have gained weight as well, but not always the case. So that's another thing that can definitely happen and more likely to happen if you're sleeping on your back than your side, just because of the gravity. And so those would be things. But if you don't have like if you sleep alone, and you don't necessarily have a bed partner, then sometimes I actually have patients like record themselves or
Yes.
use like sleep cycle to see if there's any like abnormal breathing patterns going on.
Yeah.
But I also just tell patients to ask their family doctor if they feel comfortable for it, if they're showing any of those signs. Yeah.
Yeah. Go get tested, then
Mm.
you'll know for sure.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I tell women a lot in terms of sleep is just like, yes, it's really important and yes, we should focus it on things, but I think we've talked about it lots, but not to put so much pressure on it. And the actual pressure of trying to get this perfect sleep or perfect routine actually makes sleep worse, which is not always helpful to know. Like, oh, just don't worry about it. But I think the less pressure we can put on ourselves, usually the better our sleep and the easier we have falling asleep too.
Absolutely. That's golden advice. And I think that's so valid for any challenge too, right? It's like, can we take the pressure off of you a little bit, right? And rest. Even if sleep isn't happening, because that's normal to have occasional nights where
Yeah.
sleep is a little bit bumpy, right? To segue to my final question is, so I was kind of curious for you, what do you do as a health expert when you have trouble sleeping?
Yeah. I think it would be abnormal for me to say that I don't get frustrated. I think it's one thing. I think everybody has bad nights of sleep. I think normalizing that and telling myself that too. I think that is usually where I try to double down on like my life and like what's going on. It's usually if I'm not sleeping well, it's either like I had a late um a late coffee or a caffeinated beverage, or I haven't like necessarily exercised as much, or I'm like very stressed and um feeling like burnt out and things like that. And so one thing that I will say is that if I just have a couple nights of sleep, I'll try to just normalize that for myself and be like, that's okay. This is a normal part of being human. And then if it continues on, that's kind of where I'll reflect on my life and what's going on and where I can make changes to help facilitate like a better night's sleep in the coming nights. Like, um, whether that's helping with like relaxation techniques or stress or getting more support. Decreasing coffee is usually a big one for me.
Sounds like you use like, if you're having sleep troubles, you use it kind of like a temperature gauge for for something else that might be going on in life or whatever else you might be doing that's contributing to it, rather than what's wrong with me.
Yeah, try to, for
Try
sure.
to.
Yeah, I think we all do a little bit of that when something weird is or something off is going on with our health and our life, but I try my best to make it just like somewhat of a gauge.
Maybe another word for that is like, how do we tap into acceptance when we just are up in the middle of the night for whatever reason and not allow our mind to go too far?
Yeah, it's really hard, I think, acceptance in all aspects of our life, mental health, relationships, everything. I think the more we can lean on acceptance and equanimity and things like that, the better we can be. But it's one of the hardest things to do.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. But it's probably worth it in the end to allow ourselves to practice a little bit of that when things are tough.
Little, yes. Start with the small things and then keep gradually working on the bigger things too. It's always helpful.
Thank you so much for listening to Why Can't I Sleep? If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review so that other people can find this information as well. And please visit quadrawellness.com for more resources and connect with me on social media at Quadra Wellness. I would love to hear your thoughts, questions, and feedback.